So to begin, I just wanted to start by thanking the many wonderful folks who made this event possible. This research also wouldn't exist without the contributions of so many incredible people, including my colleague and dear friend, Ellen Perleyberg. So today's presentation, I'm thinking will take 20 to 25 minutes and is divided into four major parts. First, we'll start with a brief introduction into American Jews, Jewish languages, and the present challenges to being queer inclusive. And then we'll explore what historical precedents Judaism has to offer that has shaped where we are today and where we might be able to go. We'll spend the majority of our time going over the 18 approaches to queering Jewish languages that my team has encountered in the course of this study, before ending on the factors that assist and hinder the successful implementation of these practices. So to begin, according to the Pew Research Center, about 2.4% or roughly 7.5 million Americans are Jewish. And I want to take a moment here to really challenge our understanding of what American Jews look like, and that 10% of American Jews identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. This statistics did not include trans and genderqueer individuals, and so we can only imagine that this number is higher. And while noting the obvious overlap, I think these numbers interestingly contrast the 9% of American Jews that identify as Orthodox and raise really interesting questions about whose stories we're telling. Moreover, conversations in Jewish institutions about queer inclusion have been going on for over 40 years, with the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College allowing for the ordination of queer rabbis since 1984, the Union for Reform Judaism Central Conference of American Rabbis, of which 28% of Seattle Jews are affiliated with, in contrast to the 14% in the conservative movement and 7% who are Orthodox, have allowed for the ordination of queer individuals since 1990 and the officiation of same-sex marriages since 1996. So accordingly, while previous scholarships have really focused on an identity reconciliation model, emphasizing queer Jews navigating the sometimes contradicting traditional values and personal identities, our study utilizes an alternative emerging model that recognizes the context of longer standing acceptance of queer people in religious institutions, and finds that queer people do not assume their identities to be in contradiction. This also highlights the contextualized performance of gender and sexuality in identity formation, while addressing ethno-religious discourses and rejecting Christonormative framings of religious identity. So it's important to know about the culture, context, and transmission of religious heritage languages. Most of this talk will focus on Hebrew, a religious heritage language that is found in Jewish liturgy and in sacred texts like the Torah. While Hebrew's cultural and religious significance may lead some to be resistant to change because its tradition, etc., it is important to remember that language is not frozen in time. Just as we don't speak Shakespearean English today, Hebrew has changed over the last 3,000 years from its biblical form to modern Hebrew today. Moreover, while Hebrew was the Jewish language most commonly discussed in our study, more broadly, according to Sarah Benner's Jewish Language Project, there are at least 23 Jewish languages, from Yiddish to Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. She also argues for the existence of Jewish English, which I'll be discussing more in depth later. But an example of this is in American Jews using the phrase mazel tov on a new job or at a wedding, a phrase that comes from the Yiddish that is embedded into everyday English. So the first major obstacle to queering Jewish languages is the use of grammatical gender. So like languages like Spanish and French, Hebrew operates using a grammatical masculine-feminine gender binary. In this example here, you can see that the verb for learns changes depending on the gender of the person being described. So hu lomed is he learns, and he lomedet, you can see they added the extra letter at the end here, makes the verb into the feminine. So in addition to these gendered adjectives, verbs, even inanimate objects such as the sky and a book are assigned a grammatical gender as well. Additionally, while recognizing the harm that religion has had on the queer community, I want to take a moment to challenge two assumptions. The first, that queerness is automatically in conflict with religion, and the second, that queerness is a new and unprecedented phenomenon that dates back only to the Stonewall riots in the 1960s. Rather, thinking about expansive queer inclusive language is not new, and by studying history and culture, we actually have centuries of queer ancestral knowledge to learn from. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here, but we are instead invited to follow in the tradition of changing language and making it our own. So to start, according to Rabbi Elliot Kukla, there are at least 6 genders recognized in classical Jewish texts, such as the Mishnah and Talmud and Midrash, that date from the 1st to 16th centuries CE. So this includes nekeva, v'zachal, female and male, but also includes andrinos that have both sex characteristics, tumtum with obscure sex characteristics, Alionit and Salis, whose sex characteristics change over the course of one's lifetime. And as you can see in the right-hand column here, these gender identities are mentioned hundreds of times throughout classical Jewish texts. Additionally, queer interpretation and understanding of religious texts are not new either. In these 2 texts dating from about 500 CE, on the left, we can see an understanding of Adam from the creation story of Adam and Eve as an andrino, or having both female and male characteristics. On the right, a possible explanation is given for why Abraham and Sarah originally had difficulty conceiving children, which was that they were tumtumim or had indeterminate sex characteristics. We can see here that even within the parameters of Hebrew's binary grammatical genders, this did not prevent queer understandings of gender in especially significant biblical figures. So with this brief overview of queerness in Hebrew language and Jewish tradition in mind, we can start to think about inclusive language practices. And I believe that an important part of inclusion is creating opportunities for self-determination, particularly in regards to queer identity and expression. So accordingly, before we dive into these 18 approaches in more detail, it is important to keep in mind that these findings are descriptive, not prescriptive. That means it's meant to provide an overview of what we've seen in our research thus far, as a way to inform people of the possibilities that exist. And with access to this knowledge, individuals are then able to evaluate and make an informed decision for themselves of which, if any, of these approaches works best for them and their particular context. So, in terms of building on what already exists, we have met and interviewed with Seattle Jews who do describe their gender identity as a tumtum, one of the 6 gender identities we previously discussed that Rabbi Kukla identified in classical Jewish texts. Another option we saw was rewording phrases to avoid gendered words. So for example, if I were being called up to do an aliyah or to read from the Torah, instead of calling me Elisheva and then having to decide between, am I the son of, am I the daughter of Sarah, I could just use the phrase Elisheva, mibait, or from the house of Sarah, thus completely avoiding having to gender myself. Interestingly, the conservative movement's rabbinical panel just voted and approved this liturgical change last month. This change is also found in a publication of the Reform Movement's queer inclusive liturgy text as well. Additionally, reimagining in religious contexts can create profound shifts in how we think, talk, and act. We talked to multiple rabbis who brought up their conversation with youth, particularly those about to become bar mitzvah age, about whether you can use singular pronouns for God and a lot of the generational gap they see between older generations who are more comfortable using he pronouns for God. Torta has also been doing really interesting work on switching the gender of all the characters in the Torah and rewriting this text and seeing what interpretations can come from that, such as what happens when women are committing murder, like in the story of Cain and Abel, what happens when it's instead of between two men, between two women, and what happens when men are working openly through fertility issues that the women are traditionally understood to be facing. During our research, we also encountered a rabbi who presented a drasha or sermon for Passover. And in describing the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, which you might remember from the iconic Prince of Egypt movie, she remarked on how the word for leaving Egypt shares the same root, Yud Sadi Aleph, for the modern Hebrew word for coming out of the closet, and really thinking about these shared themes of liberation, and the audience was for a queer Seder group meant to combine folks who otherwise would have been celebrating alone during the early stages of COVID. As for compound words, in a similar vein to gayborhood, the addition of queer prefixes emphasizes the queer nature of these Jewish words, such as the emphasis on gay Gemara or Talmud study in the word gaymara, and lesbian Rebbitzin, or the spouse of a rabbi, in the word Levitzin. One of my personal favorite approaches is through wordplay. So for example, a trans participant self-identified as a dreidel because he's a Jewish top. And another trans participant described being born on the wrong side of the mechitza, or the gender partition that you can see in this picture. So on the top row, we can see the various ways that one can also work within the existing language. Using the example of Sarah, which is traditionally understood as a feminine name, one could use just masculine conjugations, such as in Lomed vekotev, wherein the verbs lomed vekotev are both in the masculine, or also alternate between feminine and masculine conjugations of the verbs, like in Sarah lomed vekotevet, wherein lomed is grammatically masculine and kotevet is grammatically feminine. Similar to singular they, in English, this can also be adapted into Hebrew, but is particularly interesting as they is also gendered in Hebrew, with hen being for a feminine plural group and hem being an only masculine or a mixed gender group. And thinking about what means of expression is possible in an individual making this decision to use either hem or hen. On a similar note, the default in Hebrew is often a masculine singular. So instead of talking about the bar mitzvah process or coming of age ceremony, which is in the masculine singular, for more broadly, more communities are moving towards talking about the b'nai mitzvah process, which is the masculine and mixed gender form of the verb. Participants have also described creating their own informal system, such as the creation of the word ba instead of the gendered bar or bot. Comparatively, instead of adding a new ending, clipping has also been used to just drop the gendered portion altogether, such as changing a bar or bat mitzvah into a b mitzvah. As for making something new, alternative endings have also been proposed, such as the non-binary Hebrew project's use of modzet as a third option to the masculine modzeh or feminine modzah. Ani in the morning prayer, you can see here. The multi-gender Hebrew project has done some really interesting work in creating a font that combines the two grammatical genders. I'm currently in Jerusalem and was really excited walking home from a conference 2 weeks ago and saw this welcome sign that uses the font. And as you can see here, that combines this masculine ending, im, so you can see the yud, which kind of looks like this apostrophe up here, and the mem, which kind of looks like this box here, while also combining the feminine ending ot, which you can see as the line with the dash in it, and then you can see part of the taf there too. Another camp has interestingly offered a singular option of ol, such as in creating the word madrichol, or camp counselor, that is neutral instead of madrich, which is in the masculine, or madricha in the feminine. They've also created a plural ending that combines both the masculine plural im and the feminine plural ot into imot to make words like madrichimot for the plural. So keeping in mind the 23 Jewish languages that Sarah Benner described, it's really exciting to think about the possibilities that Jewish languages can learn from each other, especially as they vary in degrees of use of gender and grammatics and language, and from other languages as well, such as seeing the adoption of the simultaneous A and O from Spanish into Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. Finally, this is by no means an exhaustive list. As language is constantly evolving, there is an open invitation to dream and create something new. So that being said, having these practices available and the successful implementation of them are two different things. When we were talking to a queer rabbi about the challenges faced in enacting queer inclusive language in Jewish spaces, they jokingly responded with, "How long is your time?" There is work left to do. And as Rabbi Tarfon says in Bikrei Avot, it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither are you at the liberty to neglect it. So our first point I want to address is to challenge contentment, particularly in Seattle, where research is based. One participant remarked how Seattle is a quote, Seattle is a place where we think we're really liberal and wonderful, and then you drill down just one layer and you start to see that there's a lot of talk and not a lot of do, end quote. Cis heteros also rated Seattle, and particularly the Seattle bubble, as being more inclusive and identified far fewer problems than their queer counterparts. Next, I wanted to re-emphasize the need for creating and expanding queer spaces. Isolation from other queer Jews was a theme brought up by a number of participants. And in this COVID world of mass virtualization of events, we know that other means of gathering is possible. Additionally, having access to historical knowledge is important in continuing this work. Some participants noted how their motivation to learn queer Jewish language comes out of a need for preservation, particularly in the last 90 years. Participants recalled having lost Yiddish-speaking ancestors to the Holocaust and wanting to learn Yiddish because of that, or losing queer elders during the AIDS crisis, or more recently, losing elders and their knowledge to COVID-19. Age was also a commonly cited factor, from the older generations not knowing what the younger generations know about queer inclusive practice that they're learning in school or from social media, to having technological difficulties, such as implementing the use of the fonts, such as the multi-gender Hebrew project. We talked to one Hebrew teacher who was like, "I love this font." And we were like, "Great, why don't you use it?" And she goes, "I'm not going to change my PowerPoints and worksheets and homework and rewrite everything." And so really thinking through what are the practical implementations that need to happen. To the perceived age and rigidity of religion and tradition. Interestingly, intergenerational interactions, particularly having increased during the early COVID shutdowns when everyone was stuck at home, have been a significant site of intergenerational learning. My colleague and I are working on how this bottom-up learning of queer language from youth to elders, such as parents sitting in on their kids' health class where they're talking about different gender identities, intersects with the traditional top-down model of religious learning, such as learning how to light Shabbat candles from your mom or learning your grandma's latke recipes and the different modes of learning. Finally, hiring and retaining queer individuals at all levels of our institutions and communities is key. The implementation of practices like normalizing offering your pronouns during introductions, if you're comfortable with that, is often attributed to the work and presence of queer individuals. My colleagues and I are also working on identifying networks for queer Jewish learning. So just thinking, who does a parent turn to when their non-binary kid is becoming of bar, bot, b, bar mitzvah age and don't know what to call it? And who do they go to their questions with? Despite our intentional efforts to select participants from a wide range of Seattle Jewish life, most participants trace their learning back to the same 3 or 4 queer individuals, leading to questions about leveling the additional emotional and physical loads being placed on these queer individuals. To close, I just wanted to end with this quote from a participant to re-emphasize the importance of continuing this work. To quote, in queer communities, I think Judaism is overlooked as a factor in influencing how I talk and who I am. Beyond that, I think overall, it just becomes hard for me to explain to cisheads that my Jewish community is important too. The language my Jewish community uses for me is important. There's this expectation that because I'm queer, I'm not religious, because all queers are traumatized and hate religion. And that's definitely some people's stories, but that's not mine. I'm a practicing Jew and so queer non-Jews do not understand that it's just important for me to be fully accepted as a queer person in Jewish space, as it is for me to be fully accepted as a queer person in every other space. And part of that is them not getting why I'm still using Yiddish language, why I'm still learning Jewish prayers, why I'm still studying Jewish texts, and why I need things to be gender neutral when I pray. So thank you so much for letting me share our small contribution to this ongoing conversation. Please feel free to reach out via email at dyg@uw.edu, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you all in Q&A.